My name is Calla Ferris. I've worked as a contract wildlife tracker for the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency for 11 years, covering a service area that spans portions of 4 counties in the Cumberland Plateau region. My work is not glamorous and it is not mysterious. I walk transects, I read sign, I collect data, I file reports. I assess population health for deer, black bear, bobcat, turkey, and a rotating list of species under monitoring agreements with federal partners. I carry a GPS unit, a field notebook, a camera with a long lens, and a radio. I work alone about 70% of the time, in coordination with a small regional team the other 30. My supervisor is a man named Dale Ostroff who works out of the Cookeville district office and who I have never had a serious disagreement with in 11 years. I want to be clear about my professional standing because what I'm going to describe is the kind of thing that sounds, in the retelling, like the account of someone who was frightened and confused and maybe not entirely reliable. I want you to understand before I start that I have spent more hours in remote terrain than most people spend in their cars across an entire career. I do not frighten easily. I have encountered black bears at close range 17 times, including twice with cubs. I have worked active prescribed burn perimeters. I have extracted injured hunters from hollows that an ATV couldn't reach. I am not prone to misreading my environment. I want you to keep that in mind. The assignment that started all of this came in on a Tuesday in late October. A standard nuisance wildlife coordination request from a private landowner named Gerald Patton, who ran a hunting operation, guided whitetail hunts, mostly out-of-state clients, on a parcel of about 460 acres in the eastern edge of my coverage zone. Patton had been reporting irregular deer behavior to the district office for about 3 weeks before they tasked me with an assessment. His complaint was specific: the deer were not using the creek bottoms at dawn and dusk. In his words, they'd moved off the water. This sounds like a minor thing. To anyone who hunts whitetail seriously, it is not. White-tailed deer are creatures of absolute habit, particularly around water sources during the rut lead-up. When they abandon established patterns, something has changed in the environment. That change is almost always explainable. A new predator pressure. Hunting pressure from a neighboring parcel. A water quality issue. A human activity that's altered their comfort threshold. My job was to figure out which one. I logged the assignment at 8:14 a.m. Called Patton at 8:22. He was curt, not unfriendly, a man used to managing his operation without outside interference, tolerating my involvement as a necessary step toward whatever resolution he wanted. He told me his guides had been seeing the deer push toward the upper ridgelines well before first light, which was backward for the season. He also mentioned that 3 of his hunting dogs, he ran them for hog work on a neighboring parcel he leased, had refused to enter the creek bottom 2 days prior. Just sat at the tree line and would not go down. I wrote that down. I noted it without weight at the time. He gave me access permission for the full parcel and a gate code for the Eastern Service Road. I told him I'd do an initial walk-in assessment within the week and file a preliminary report within 10 days of that. Standard timeline. I thanked him and drove out the following Thursday. The Eastern Plateau is not wilderness in any dramatic sense. It is working land, timber cuts in various stages of regrowth, agricultural fields edging up against hollow timber, gravel roads connecting one private parcel to another. There are houses visible from most ridgelines. Cell service is inconsistent but not absent. The creeks run cold and clear off the limestone shelves, and in October they carry that particular quality of light that makes the plateau look like something from before any of this, before the roads and the property lines and the gate codes, like something that was always here and is only allowing the rest of it to exist on a temporary basis. I parked at the gate just past 7 a.m. Signed into my field notebook. Air temperature 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Overcast, light southeast wind, no rain in the last 5 days. Visibility good. I pulled my GPS unit, confirmed my waypoints from the topo map I'd prepped the night before, checked my radio, and started down the service road toward the first transect line. The first 2 hours were unremarkable. I found abundant deer sign in the upland timber, fresh scrapes on the ridge edge, rubs on saplings that told me a mature buck was working the area, tracks in a soft clay bank that showed a healthy mix of doe and fawn movement. The sign was good. The population was clearly present. But Patton was right, it was all on the high ground. The ridgeline, the upper timber, the dry side slopes. Nothing below the 40-foot contour. I walked down into the first creek bottom around 9:30. The change was immediate. Not dramatic. Not a sound or a sight. More like a quality of the air. I've spent enough time in the field to know the difference between a hollow that's quiet because nothing's there and a hollow that's quiet because everything left. The first kind of quiet is empty. The second kind has weight to it. This was the second kind. The leaf litter was undisturbed. The creek bank, which should have shown overnight deer tracks in the soft mud near the water, was clean. A great blue heron that would normally have been stationed at the downstream bend was absent. The creek itself was running fine, clear, cold, moving normally over the limestone shelf. I stood there for about 4 minutes, just reading it. Then I walked the bank for a quarter mile in each direction. No deer sign below the valley floor. No raccoon tracks at the water's edge. No turkey scratchings in the leaves. No squirrel diggings on the soft banks. The small mammal activity that should have been written into every square foot of that ground was simply not there. I noted it in my field book. 947, creek bottom. 0 mammal sign in surveyed section. Heron absent from established station. Deer sign concentrated above ridgeline, not present in bottom. Cause undetermined. Will expand transect to secondary creek drainage. I climbed back up to the ridge and ate half a sandwich. Drank some water. Watched the timber for 20 minutes. A crow landed in a tulip poplar about 60 yards away and immediately left. I didn't write that down. I should have. The secondary drainage was about a mile north along the ridge. A smaller watershed, Feeder Creek running into the main channel about half a mile below. I reached it around 11:15 and descended into it from the north slope, which gave me a good angle on the creek bed before I was close enough to disturb anything. Same thing. Clean banks. Still air. The kind of absence that is its own presence. I stayed in that bottom for about 40 minutes, working slowly, looking for anything that might explain what I was seeing. A chemical spill would leave a residue on the creek surface, a sheen, sometimes a smell. There was none. A disease event in the deer herd would show up in the tracks, irregular gait, dragging, bedding in unusual locations, but there were no tracks at all. A predator establishing a home range in the bottom would suppress prey movement, but a predator still leaves sign of its own, and I found nothing. What I found, eventually, was a game camera. Patton's, almost certainly, he'd mentioned he had cameras up throughout the property. This one was mounted on a white oak about 4 feet off the ground, aimed at a well-used deer trail that ran along the bank. Standard setup. The camera was a cellular model, meaning it transmitted photos directly to a receiver rather than storing them locally on a card. I photographed the camera's position for my report and noted it in my field book. I didn't review its data, that wasn't my access to make without Patton present, but I logged its location as a data point. If the camera had been triggering, Patton would have images. If it hadn't been triggering, that was itself information. I called him from the ridge on my way back to the truck. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what I'd found: the clean banks, the absence of sign, the concentration of deer in the upland timber. I told him it was consistent with a disturbance in the bottom, origin unclear, and that I wanted to come back for a second assessment after reviewing any imagery from his cameras. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The cameras stopped sending." I asked when. "About the same time the dogs wouldn't go down." I drove back to my home office, which is a converted back bedroom in my house in Cookville, and spent that evening organizing my field notes and pulling up what I could find on documented causes for widespread prey avoidance in creek bottom habitats. I was not operating in the dark here. This is a known phenomenon in wildlife biology. Prey species respond to predator presence, contaminant events, seismic microactivity, and, occasionally, electromagnetic anomalies near buried infrastructure. I'd seen versions of it before. There is always an explanation. The discipline of wildlife tracking is fundamentally a discipline of explanation. You look at what is present and what is absent and you reconstruct what happened. You do not invent a cause. You find one. I filed a preliminary field note to Dale at 9:15 p.m., flagging the bottom avoidance as potentially multi-species and requesting access to TWRA's regional contaminant incident records for the watershed. It was a routine request. I expected a routine response. What I got back, at 6:52 the next morning, was a brief email saying the contaminant records for that watershed were under a joint review with the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation and were not currently accessible for field-level requests. Dale noted that this was not unusual for parcels and active coordination agreements and told me to continue my assessment with available field data. I read that email 3 times. It was not unusual for parcels and active coordination agreements. Patton's land was a private hunting operation. I had no reason to think it was in any coordination agreement with TDEC. I replied asking for clarification on what the coordination covered and when it had been initiated. Dale's response came in an hour later, and it said, "I'll look into it and get back to you. Let me know what your next field day looks like." I told him I was planning to return the following Tuesday. He said that worked. He never got back to me about the coordination agreement. I want to pause here and describe something I've come to think of as the grammar of institutional deflection, because I've now encountered it enough times in my career to recognize its structure. It has a particular shape. A question is acknowledged but not answered. The acknowledgement itself is framed in language that implies the answer is available, just not to you, right now, for reasons that are procedurally legitimate. The deflection doesn't feel like a door being closed. It feels like a door that is almost certainly going to open, soon, and you just need to wait a moment. I had not yet reached the point where I recognized what I was looking at. That came later. On Tuesday I went back. October 29th. I'm going to be precise about what I observed and when because precision is what I have. It is the only thing I have that cannot be reinterpreted. 7:18 a.m., arrived at the eastern gate. Temperature 38 degrees Fahrenheit, light frost on the service road, clear sky, west wind. No other vehicles. 7:34 a.m., descended into the main creek bottom via the North Trail. The frost stopped at the tree line. Not gradually, at the tree line. The leaf litter inside the bottom showed no frost despite the temperature and the clear overnight sky. I stood at the boundary for about 30 seconds. I stepped in. I stepped back out. The frost was there. The frost was not there. I noted it. I took photographs with the timestamps active. 8:02 a.m., reached the main creek. Bank still clean. Still no sign. I crouched at the water's edge and held my hand near the surface without touching it. The air above the water was warmer than it should have been. Not dramatically. Not alarmingly. Just warmer. I took a temperature reading with the weather meter I carry. Air temp at the surface, 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Ridge air temp from earlier in my approach, 38 degrees Fahrenheit. A 10-degree differential within a vertical drop of maybe 60 feet. I had no instrument that told me this was wrong. I had training and 11 years of experience that told me this was wrong. 8:44 a.m., reached the game camera location. The camera was still mounted to the tree. The indicator light, which should have been blinking green for active cellular transmission, was off. I have no authority to open or access client equipment without the client present, so I did not handle it. But I used my own camera to photograph the indicator light from 3 feet away. Off. No power. It was a battery-operated unit, and it had been installed relatively recently. The mounting hardware showed minimal weathering. 9:11 a.m. I found the first one. I almost didn't recognize it for what it was. It was in the leaf litter about 12 feet off the creek bank, partially obscured by a fallen sycamore branch. I saw it as color first, an irregularity in the neutral browns and grays. When I got close enough, I understood what I was looking at. It was a deer. A doe, I estimated 2.5 to 3 years old, body in good condition, no visible wound, no sign of predator contact. She was lying on her side in a position that looked, genuinely, like she had simply stopped. Not fallen. Not collapsed in a way that suggested struggle. Positioned, almost. Legs in a natural lateral arrangement, head settled rather than thrown back or twisted. The posture of an animal that lay down and did not get up. I backed away from the carcass. I did not approach closer than 6 feet. I documented it in my field book. 9/11, single whitetail doe, estimated 2.5 to 3 years, natural body condition, no apparent wound or predation. Unusual death posture. GPS coordinates logged. Photographed. I immediately called Dale. He didn't answer. I left a voicemail describing what I'd found and asking whether I should wait for a state veterinarian or collect a tissue sample myself with my emergency kit. I followed the voicemail with a text message containing the GPS coordinates. I waited 22 minutes. He called back. He told me to flag the carcass with survey tape and note the coordinates, and that he'd arrange for the regional wildlife veterinarian to come out and assess. He asked if I'd touched it. I said no. He said good. He said it might be several days before the vet could get out there, given her caseload. I asked if I should continue my survey. He paused for a moment and then said yes, continue, document anything else you find, and we'll compile everything for the vet's visit. I said I would. I found 2 more before noon. The second deer was 112 meters northeast of the first, according to my GPS. Another doe, same condition, same posture, same absence of any sign that the animal had experienced fear, pain, or struggle before dying. The third was a button buck, this year's fawn, still young, maybe 90 pounds, about 60 meters west of the second, near the feeder creek. 3 deer. All in the bottom. All in a death posture that looked less like predation or disease than like something I did not have a clinical term for. I photographed all of them. I logged all the GPS points. I marked them with orange survey tape. I did not handle any of them. At 12:44 p.m. I climbed back to the ridgeline, ate my lunch, and sat for a long time looking at the timber. A group of deer, 4 dozen a young buck, moved through the upland timber about 200 meters north of me. Moving freely. Alert, normal gait, pausing to browse without apparent distress. Healthy animals. They were moving parallel to the ridge. Away from the creek bottom. That afternoon I did something outside the standard scope of my assignment. I drove about 6 miles east along the county road to a trailhead that accessed an adjacent parcel, public land, a portion of the Cumberland State Forest, and walked a 2-mile transect along a creek drainage that ran roughly parallel to Patton's Creek but was separated from it by a limestone ridge. I found nothing. Normal sign. Deer tracks at the water's edge. A raccoon print in the mud. A great blue heron standing in the shallows about a 1/4 mile downstream. The creek bottom on that side of the ridge was operating exactly as it should. The avoidance was not regional. It was specific to Patton's drainage. I drove home. That evening I went through what I knew about the watershed. I pulled up the county GIS layer on my laptop and looked at the topography, the land ownership parcels, the watershed boundaries. Patton's Creek drained eastward, off the limestone shelf, fed by several feeder streams coming down from the ridge. The topography was standard plateau edge geology. Nothing unusual about the drainage pattern. But there was something in the parcel history. Patton had owned his 460 acres since 2009. Before that, the parcel had changed hands 3 times in 12 years, 1997, 2003, and 2008. That kind of transaction frequency on rural plateau land is not normal. Plateau land tends to hold. Families keep it. When it turns over that fast, something is usually wrong with it. I looked up the parcel's TDEC environmental database listing. The entry loaded. Then I looked at the associated permits and assessments. The most recent environmental assessment was dated 2007. Filed by a company called Meridian Applied Research, LLC. The document category was listed as Subsurface Characterization Study. The document itself was not available for public download. The status field read, Under Coordinated Review. Under Coordinated Review. The same language Dale had used when I'd asked about the contaminant records. I searched for Meridian Applied Research. The company did not appear in the Tennessee Secretary of State's Business Registry. It did not appear in a general web search in any form that was useful. One result from a federal procurement database listed it as a subcontractor on a research services contract dated 2004, with no description of the work and no contact information. The prime contractor on that federal listing was the name of a federal agency I recognized but did not expect to see associated with a wildlife parcel in the Cumberland Plateau. I closed the browser. I sat at my desk for a while. Then I opened a fresh page in my field notebook and wrote down exactly what I'd found and where I'd found it. Date and time at the top. Not because I was frightened. Because I am a tracker, and the first discipline of tracking is to record what is actually there before you start explaining it. The following week was professionally unremarkable. I filed my field notes from the patent survey with the district office, including the GPS coordinates of the 3 carcasses and the photographic documentation. I received a confirmation of receipt from Dale's assistant. I asked Dale by email when the wildlife veterinarian was scheduled to go out. He said he'd follow up. He followed up 4 days later with a message that said the vet had been unable to reach the carcasses due to a scheduling conflict but would be rescheduling soon. I asked whether the carcasses were still viable for tissue sampling, given the time elapsed. He said the vet would make that determination. I was not satisfied with that answer, but I had no standing to escalate it. Dale was my supervisor. The veterinary coordination was his operational domain. I returned to my regular rotation, 3 other active monitoring assignments in different parts of my coverage zone, and let the week turn over. What I did not stop doing was thinking about the frost line. The frost stopping at the tree line was not a thing I could explain. I have read the temperature differential at creek bottoms before. Cold air sinks, and creek bottoms in sheltered hollows can trap cold air in ways that create unexpected microclimates. But that differential runs the other direction. Creek bottoms are usually colder than the surrounding ridgeline, not warmer. What I had measured on October 29th was a creek bottom running 10 degrees warmer than the ridge above it at 8 o'clock in the morning on a clear, frosty day. I spent 2 evenings researching the conditions under which a sheltered hollow can retain warmth against overnight radiative cooling. There are documented cases involving geothermal activity. Certain plateau regions sit above limestone aquifer systems that can carry thermally elevated groundwater, but geothermal influence at the temperature differentials I'd recorded would be regionally detectable. It would show up in the TDEC groundwater temperature monitoring data. I requested that data through the standard field-level access portal. The request returned a message I hadn't seen before. Access to this dataset is currently restricted pending coordinated review. Please contact your district supervisor for access inquiries. I did not contact Dale. I had already established, privately, that contacting Dale about this particular word, coordinated, produced answers that were not answers. Instead, I contacted a colleague of mine named Bryn Achterberg, who works as a habitat restoration specialist for the State Forestry Division and who has, in 14 years of her career, developed a working knowledge of the bureaucratic geography of Tennessee environmental agencies that I have always found useful. She is not a close friend. We are professional colleagues who share a respect for each other's competence and who meet for coffee at the Cookeville District Office 3 or 4 times a year. She is careful, thorough, and not easily moved to speculation. I called her on a Wednesday afternoon and described what I was looking at, keeping it factual, the avoidance pattern, the temperature differential, the carcasses, the restricted records, and the phrase that kept appearing in different corners of the system. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "How long has that parcel been under coordinated review?" I said the earliest document I could find with that language was dated 2007. She said, "Kala, coordinated review in the TDEC environmental system is a hold status. It means an outside agency with superseding jurisdiction has flagged that parcel for monitoring and restricted public access to associated records. It's not common. I've seen it twice in 14 years. I asked what outside agency would have that authority over a state environmental record. She said, either EPA or one of the federal land agencies. But EPA coordinated review is normally disclosed as EPA. When it's not disclosed, when the language just says coordinated review without naming the party, she stopped. I waited. I honestly don't know, she said. I've never seen it happen that way. November 12th. I went back to the parcel. I want to be honest, I was not authorized to return at this point. My formal assessment assignment had been completed and filed. Patton had not requested a follow-up visit. I did not call ahead. I used the gate code he had given me during the initial access authorization, which had not been rescinded. I told myself that I was verifying the integrity of the flagged carcass sites. That is partially true. What is entirely true is that I needed to stand in that bottom again and look at it with the information I now had. 7:51 a.m. I parked on the service road, well back from the gate, and walked in. The temperature differential was still there. I recorded it. Ridge, 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Creek bottom, 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Same 9 to 10 degree inversion. The carcasses were gone. All three. No bones, no hide, no survey tape. The leaf litter over the sites was largely undisturbed, not the pattern left by scavengers, which is chaotic, but the pattern left by deliberate removal. The survey tape I had tied to the branches above each site was cut, not torn. I stood at the location of the first deer for a long time. Then I looked at the game camera. The indicator light was green. I have replayed that moment many times. I want to be precise about my reaction, because my reaction is data. What I felt was not fear. What I felt was the specific, clarifying alertness of a tracker who has just found a print that shouldn't be where it is. The camera had been dead on October 29th. It was active now. That meant someone had serviced it. That meant someone had been on this parcel between my last visit and this morning. I photographed the camera from the same angle I'd used last time. Indicator light green. Same frame, different state. Then I checked the creek bank. The bank was still clean of wildlife sign. But there were boot prints. Recent ones, from the look of the mud, pressed into the soft bank within the last 24 to 48 hours, before last night's temperature drop would have firmed the mud surface back up. Two distinct sole patterns. Two people. They had walked along the bank from the direction of the hollow's north entrance and walked back out the same way. I photographed the prints. I measured the stride length. I noted the boot size estimates. I documented everything I could without disturbing the prints. Then I left. I walked back to my truck, drove off the property, and sat in my truck on the county road for about 15 minutes. Then I called Bryn. I told her what I'd found. The camera reactivated. The carcasses removed. The boot prints. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Did you take the photographs?" I said yes. She said, "Send them to me." I asked why. She said, "Because I want to see whether those boot prints have a standard commercial sole pattern or something issued." I had not thought of that. Bryn had. I sent her the photographs that afternoon. She got back to me 2 hours later. The smaller pair is Danner Mountain Light. Standard commercial sale. The larger pair, she paused. I'm not getting a commercial match. The lug pattern is wrong for anything in my reference database. It might just be an older boot I'm not finding. But Kala. Yeah. The stride length on the larger pair. You said you measured it. Roughly, yeah. In the field. 31 inches on the straight bank sections. She was quiet for a moment. That's long, she said. It's on the outer edge of normal for a tall person. Right, she said. But it's consistent throughout your documented sequence. I looked back at my notes. Yes. not variable. Not the kind of variation you see when someone's carrying weight or moving carefully over uncertain footing. No, I said. It's even. She didn't say anything for a moment. Okay, she said. I don't know what to do with that. I told her I didn't either. I filed a supplemental field report to Dale on November 13th, describing my unauthorized visit, the removal of the flagged carcasses, the camera reactivation, and the unidentified boot prints. I included all photographs. I disclosed that I had returned to the property outside my assignment parameters and offered that disclosure voluntarily rather than waiting for it to surface. I want to be clear about why I disclosed it, not to protect myself professionally, though I understood that transparency was my best option. I disclosed it because the supplemental data was important, and suppressing it to protect my own record would have been a failure of the work. If you track, you report what you find. Dale's response came the following morning. He thanked me for the transparency. He said the carcass removal would have been coordinated through the district veterinary office. He said the camera reactivation was likely just a battery replacement by Patton's guides. He said the boot prints were consistent with routine property maintenance access. He did not ask me why the carcasses had been removed before the veterinarian assessed them. He did not ask about the temperature differential. He did not address the fact that Patton had given no indication of sending anyone to the property. He said he was closing the formal assessment on the Patton parcel, as the animal mortality event had been addressed, and asked me to close out the file and redirect my capacity to 2 new assignments he was attaching. I looked at the 2 new assignments. One was a turkey population count in a different county. The other was a bear nuisance assessment near a residential development 30 miles west. Both were completely legitimate tasks. Both were also completely away from the Cumberland Plateau's eastern edge. I confirmed receipt. I did not close the file. What I did instead was begin talking to hunters. This is not as lateral a move as it sounds. Hunters in this region, the ones who have been working the same hollows and creek bottoms for 20, 30 years, maintain a form of environmental record that no agency database holds. They notice when a creek bottom goes quiet. They notice when game moves off water. They have been watching the same ground for generations, and the patterns they carry in their heads are not anecdotal, they are longitudinal. They are exactly the kind of baseline data I needed. I am known in this community. 11 years of field work, some of it in direct coordination with hunting lease operations, has given me a standing that is useful. I am not an outsider. I am someone who walks the same ground they do and respects what they know. I started calling around in mid-November. Not formally. Not under any agency banner. I framed it as background research for a seasonal wildlife movement study, which is true enough to be accurate and vague enough not to raise questions. What I found was a pattern that went back further than I expected. The first person I spoke to was a man named Roy Embry, 64 years old, who has hunted the eastern plateau since he was old enough to carry a rifle. Roy's family has leased the same hollow in the next drainage north of Patton's parcel for over 30 years. When I described the avoidance behavior I'd been observing, deer moving off water, sign disappearing from creek bottoms, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's been happening in my bottom for going on 4 years now." 4 years. Not 4 weeks. Not 1 season. 4 years. I asked him to describe it. He said it came and went. Some weeks the bottom ran fine, deer at the water, turkeys working the leaves down by the creek, everything normal. Other weeks it went quiet the same way I'd described. He'd figured it was a predator working through. Mountain lion presence in the plateau had been picking up over the past decade, and an active cat will suppress an entire drainage. But the periods of avoidance didn't match what he'd expect from a predator moving through. They weren't building and releasing on a predator's schedule. They were something else. It's almost like, he stopped. I waited. It's almost like something's cycling, he said. Like a switch. I asked if he'd ever reported it. He said he'd mentioned it to a game warden once, a few years back. The warden had noted it and said he'd follow up. Roy never heard anything back. Game warden retire or leave? I asked. Roy paused. Yeah, actually. He left the district about a year after I talked to him. Moved out of state, I heard. I spoke to 4 more hunters over the following 2 weeks. 3 of them were working hollows and creek drainages within a 12-mile radius of Patton's parcel. All 3 had observations consistent with what Roy described, periodic avoidance patterns, cyclical rather than progressive, creek bottoms going quiet and then returning to normal over periods that ranged from several days to several weeks. The 4th hunter was farther out, about 20 miles northeast, in a county that technically sat outside my coverage zone. His name was Marcus Webb, and he had not been hunting his parcel for the past 2 seasons because, in his words, there's nothing there to hunt anymore. He said the avoidance on his creek bottom had started about 3 years ago and had not cycled back to normal. It had simply continued. Permanent, or close enough to permanent that the distinction didn't matter practically. His deer herd had vacated the bottom entirely and had redistributed to the upland timber. He'd stopped running his cameras below the ridgeline because they stopped transmitting. I asked if he'd had any contact with state or federal agencies about the pattern. He said he'd gotten a letter from a TDEC regional coordinator about 2 years ago, informing him that his watershed was under a monitoring agreement and that he would be notified of any findings relevant to his land use. He had not been notified of any findings. I asked if he still had the letter. He said he did. He sent me a photograph of it. The letterhead was TDEC. The signature was a regional coordinator name I didn't recognize. The language in the body of the letter was standard monitoring agreement language, neutral, procedural, the kind of text that can be read 3 times without transmitting any actual information. What drew my attention was a single line near the bottom of the 2nd paragraph. This monitoring agreement is conducted in coordination with the Cumberland Plateau Resource Assessment Program. I searched for the Cumberland Plateau Resource Assessment Program. The search returned one result, a reference in the minutes of a Tennessee Environmental Quality Commission meeting from 9 years ago, noting that the program had been established under a memorandum of understanding between the state and a federal partner agency. The minutes did not name the federal partner agency. The motion to establish the program had passed unanimously. The relevant MOU was described as available through the Commission's Records Office. I submitted a public records request to the Commission's Records Office. The automated confirmation came back immediately. The substantive response took 11 business days, and when it arrived, it said that the requested Memorandum of Understanding was classified as a non-public document under the Tennessee Public Records Act's exemption for records whose disclosure would be contrary to any state or federal law. There is a specific quality of stillness that comes with the realization that the obstruction you have been encountering is not bureaucratic friction but architectural. Bureaucratic friction is normal. Systems have inefficiencies. Documents get misfiled. Supervisors don't follow up on things they said they'd follow up on. Appointments get rescheduled. These things happen, and they are genuinely unremarkable, and a careful person does not mistake them for something deliberate. But there is a point at which the pattern of obstruction becomes too consistent to be inefficiency. When every inquiry about a specific geography returns the same holding language. When the records are not misfiled but restricted. When the MOU is not unavailable but classified. When the federal partner is not unnamed by accident but unnamed by design. I had reached that point. I want to be careful about how I describe my thinking at this stage, because I am aware of how the next part of this account reads. I am a wildlife tracker. My professional competency lies in reading physical environments, terrain, sign, behavior, biological indicators. I am not an investigator. I am not a bureaucratic analyst. I do not have a background that makes me well equipped to read institutional structures or to understand what kind of federal-state coordination would require a classified MOU governing a wildlife monitoring program in rural Tennessee. What I have is a discipline. The discipline of tracking. And the first rule of tracking, the one that precedes everything else, is, if the sign you are reading doesn't fit the explanation you've proposed, the explanation is wrong. You do not discard the sign. You discard the explanation and find one that fits. The explanation I had been operating under, routine environmental monitoring, routine agency coordination, routine bureaucratic slowness, no longer fit the sign. I needed a better explanation. The conversation that reoriented my thinking happened in late November, at the Cookeville district office, not in Dale's office but in the parking lot outside it, with a man named Earl Pryor. Earl Pryor is a retired state geologist who now consults part-time for a land use assessment firm. I had met him twice before at professional events, the kind of man who is conversationally detailed in a way that some people find exhausting and that I have always appreciated, because the detail is usually accurate. He'd been at the district office that day for reasons unrelated to anything I was working on. We ended up in the parking lot at the same time, and he asked how things were going, the way people do. I am not a person who normally discusses active professional concerns in parking lots. But I had been sitting with this for 6 weeks, and Bryn's knowledge had reached its limit, and Dale was not a resource I could use for this particular question. So I gave Earl a version of what I was seeing. Stripped of the names and specifics, framed as a general geological question, what conditions in Cumberland Plateau limestone geology could produce a thermally elevated creek bottom with a consistent 9 to 10 degree inversion relative to the surrounding ridge, specifically in a localized drainage rather than across the broader watershed? He looked at me for a moment. The kind of look that means someone is deciding something about you. Then he said, "How localized?" I said, "Approximately half a mile of creek drainage. Maybe slightly longer." He said, "And the inversion is consistent. Not variable with ambient temperature, not tidal in relation to precipitation." I said, "Consistent across 2 separate observation dates 6 weeks apart, similar meteorological conditions." He nodded slowly. "That profile," he said, "is not natural geology." I waited. Natural geothermal influence in a limestone plateau system would be diffuse. It would show up across the broader aquifer system, not in a single drainage. To get that kind of localized, consistent thermal elevation in a surface creek, you would need either a point source heat input, something generating heat at a specific subsurface location and transferring it to the groundwater, or a subsurface system that is actively circulating thermally elevated water through a confined channel. "What kind of point source heat input?" I asked. He looked at me again. "The kind that would require a classified MOU and a federal coordination agreement," he said. Then he said, "I'd be careful with this, Calla." He said it the way you say something when you mean it completely and have decided not to say more. I went home and I sat with that for 2 days. On the third day I made a decision that I have thought about carefully every day since, and that I believe was correct, and that I would make again under the same circumstances. I called the EPA regional office. Not the coordinated review desk. Not any line that was associated with the Cumberland Plateau Resource Assessment Program. I called the regional public information line and I asked, in general terms, about the agency's jurisdiction over monitoring agreements involving subsurface thermal anomalies on private land. The person I spoke to was helpful and generic and told me nothing I didn't already know about EPA's standard environmental monitoring authorities. I thanked them and hung up. Then I called a journalist. Her name is Patience Osei. She covers state government and environmental issues for a regional news outlet that operates across a 5-county footprint in the Upper Cumberland. I had been a background source for her twice before, both times on wildlife management topics well within my professional domain, and she had handled those conversations with precision and discretion. She is not a sensationalist. She is someone who understands the difference between a document and a story. I met her at a coffee shop in a town that was not Cookeville and that was not within my formal coverage zone. I brought my field notebook and the photographs and the printed MOU records request response and the letter Marcus Webb had sent me. I told her what I'd found. In order. With dates. With the specific language from each document. Without speculation about what was underneath it. She listened. She took notes. She asked clarifying questions that were precise and well-targeted. When I finished, she sat back and looked at what I'd given her. The thermal data, she said. That's your strongest piece. It's also the most unusual for an independent field observation, I said. The instrument I used is calibrated, but it's a field weather meter. It's accurate within a degree or two under standard conditions. But you have two separate observation dates showing the same differential. Yes. And you have the geographic clustering of the avoidance behavior across multiple landholdings over multiple years. Across 5 separate landholders. Yes. And you have the MOU exemption. Which tells you there's an MOU. It doesn't tell you what's in it. She nodded. And the federal procurement listing for Meridian Applied Research. Which puts a company with no public footprint on a federal contract with an agency whose involvement with a rural Tennessee wildlife parcel has no obvious explanation. She looked at her notes for a long time. I'm going to need to do a lot of records work before I can publish anything, she said. And I want to be transparent with you. Some of this may not go anywhere that can be sourced publicly. The MOU exemption is designed to hold. I said I understood that. What I can do, she said, is file a series of targeted public records requests and see what they shake loose. Sometimes the denials are as informative as the documents. I told her I thought that was exactly right. She looked at me. Are you going to get in trouble for this? I considered the question. I think the question of whether I get in trouble, I said, is probably less important than the question of what is in that drainage. She nodded once. The way a person nods when they agree with something and don't need to say so. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, 3 things have happened. The first, Patience filed 7 public records requests across TDEC, the Environmental Quality Commission, the Tennessee Department of Agriculture, and 2 federal agencies. 5 have returned denial notices. 2 are still pending. The denials are, as she predicted, informative. Each one cites a specific exemption. 2 of the exemptions are the same statute, a provision that covers records whose disclosure would compromise an ongoing federal investigative or research program. Investigative or research program. Not a monitoring agreement. Not an environmental coordination. A research program. The second, I received an email from Dale Ostroff last week informing me that my coverage zone was being restructured as part of a regional efficiency review, and that my Eastern Plateau assignments were being transferred to another contractor. The email was cordial, professional, and framed entirely around the restructuring. There was no mention of the patent parcel. There was no mention of my supplemental field report or my unauthorized November visit. My eastern coverage zone, including every drainage within 20 miles of patent's parcel, was simply no longer mine. I confirmed receipt and thanked him for the communication. I did not ask questions. The third, I went back. I know what that sounds like. But I am a tracker. And there was one thing I had not done in any of my previous visits, because I had not yet understood what I was looking at. I had been measuring the surface, the bank, the leaf litter, the carcass positions, the frost line. I had not looked at the water. I went back on a day when the sky was overcast and the light was flat and even, which is the best light for reading a water surface. I walked the creek bottom from the northern entry point to where the creek curved east toward the parcel boundary. I walked slowly. I was not logging this as a professional field visit. I was not carrying agency equipment. I had my personal camera, my personal field notebook, a temperature meter I own independently. The thermal inversion was still present. 51 degrees at the water surface. 42 degrees at ridge level. A 9-degree differential on a 40-degree day. I walked to a section of the creek where the water moves over a flat limestone shelf, shallow enough that the stream bed is clearly visible. In good flat light, water over limestone is essentially transparent. You can see every contour of the rock beneath. I stood over that shelf for about 10 minutes. The limestone looked normal. The same pale gray, the same algae growth at the downstream edges, the same fine sediment gathered in the low pockets. Except, in 3 locations along the shelf, spaced irregularly, not in a pattern I could immediately describe, the limestone showed a slight discoloration. Not the green-brown of algae. Not the orange-red of iron oxide. A faint, warm discoloration, almost amber, almost the color of heat viewed through a material not quite opaque enough to hide it. I photographed all 3 locations. Flat light. Multiple exposures. As close as I could get while staying out of the water. Then I stood back up and looked down the drainage toward the parcel boundary, toward wherever the water went after it left this land. The creek runs east off the plateau. It joins a larger stream about 2 miles below the property line. That stream runs through another 3 private parcels before it reaches a county road culvert. Below the culvert, it runs through open farm land for another 4 miles before joining a tributary of the Connie Fork River. The Connie Fork feeds Center Hill Lake. Center Hill Lake provides drinking water to portions of 4 counties. I stood on the limestone shelf with that information and looked at the amber discoloration in the rock beneath the warm water, and I thought about the 3 deer lying in the posture of animals that had simply stopped, and about the camera that went dead and then came back on, and about the boot prints with the even stride length, and about the classified MOU and the federal research program and the 11 years I had spent reading sign in this landscape and trusting what I read. I walked out of the bottom. I drove home. I called patience. I am telling you this because I believe in the value of the record, the external record, the one that exists outside the system currently managing this information. I have learned, in the past 2 months, that institutional records are only as useful as the institution's willingness to hold them honestly. What I have is a field notebook, a camera roll, and a series of public records responses that are each, individually, explicable, and that are, collectively, not. I do not know what is in that drainage. I want to be honest about that. I have a thermal anomaly, a behavioral response in multiple species across a 12-mile radius, 3 unexplained deer mortalities that were removed before veterinary assessment, a game camera reactivated by persons unknown, boot prints from an unknown party, a classified interagency agreement, a federal research program exemption, and a geological profile that my consultant described as not natural. What I do not have is a direct explanation. I am not going to fabricate one. What I will tell you is this: I have tracked animals across this landscape for 11 years, and the one thing I know with certainty about every living thing I have ever followed is that it moves away from what harms it. Not always fast. Not always efficiently. But consistently, across species, across seasons, across every variable of terrain and weather and pressure, living things move away from harm. The deer moved to the high ground. The heron left the bend. The crow landed and immediately left. The dog sat at the tree line and would not go down. Every animal in that drainage made the same assessment and reached the same conclusion, and they did it without public records requests and without my 11 years of professional training and without a journalist filing requests across 5 agencies. They just read what was there. I have spent 2 months trying to do the same thing. The records are still pending. The water is still warm.